Next up, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown, the wide receiver out of USC, who, for me at least, was one of my more anticipated evaluations coming in, as it's pretty rare that I'll watch film on one guy and consistently notice somebody else popping, right? But that was exactly what happened. As I was doing my sort of deep dive and film analysis of Elijah Vera Tucker, the Trojans' talented guard slash tackle prospect. Obviously, if you haven't seen that video, click the link above my head. But as I was really watching him and diving into a ton of his games, you constantly saw this other number 8 wide receiver making these beautiful contested catches in the end zone, these fantastic toe tap grabs along the sidelines, and really just these splash plays that appeared to be bailing out the USC offense, right, and really driving a lot of their production. So off the back of that, when you realize, hey, he's draft eligible, not only that, he's a top 100 prospect. Well, hey, then let me dive in and see, was what I saw in those sort of flashes equivalent to what you'd see when you watch him on a snap to snap basis, right? So the first thing you're going to see then as we get into his sort of statistical production is a really nice 2019 season, as well as some great numbers in 2018 as a freshman as well. I think that one thing that's pretty interesting, though, however, to note is the different ways that USC was using him in 19 compared to 20. In 2019, he was primarily more so used out of the slot, right? Because for those who remember, obviously USC had a pretty highly regarded receiver prospect come out in last year's draft in Michael Pittman, obviously now of the Indianapolis Colts, who was sort of the bigger bodied guy who was more so taking on those number one corners and playing on the outside. I feel like St. Brown was more so the other guy, right? More so that slot receiver who was more of the beneficiary of Pittman and the attention that he attracted more so than anything else, right? And I think that you sort of saw that in his 2020 film now when USC decided, hey, let's use him primarily as an outside receiver, more so to fill that number one role left absent by Pittman. And I think that you saw that just wasn't his thing, right? He's more so better relegated to that second or third option on the offense. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's kind of what we saw out of Juju Smith-Schuster, right? You see him in Pittsburgh have a great season while Antonio Brown is there when he's facing number 2 cornerbacks. And then once AB leaves, now he has to face number ones, and you sort of see that statistical regression. Well, Juju's not a different player than he was a year ago. He didn't get worse. He's not slower. He doesn't have worse hands, but it's just now the attention that he has to attract due to his teammates or lack thereof is a little bit too much for him to handle, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. I just think that's sort of a similar picture that St. Brown was painting in 2019 and 2020, if that makes sense when you contrast those 2 years. Not that he was on the way to having a bad season by any means. Obviously only played 6 games due to the pandemic shortened year, but was still doing solid. It was just clear that he was struggling a little bit more in terms of getting open and consistently producing as he was in years past, if that makes sense. I will say from there, in terms of his pro day numbers, one thing that kind of jumps out is, unlike a lot of the other guys we've done so far, much less so of a physical freak than those guys, right? We're talking about the Terrace Marshalls, the Moores, alongside all the top 3 guys, right? Waddle, Chase, Smith, right? You contrast their numbers to St. Brown's and you sort of see a difference start to form. Obviously, first and foremost, the 40, 4.61, right? Significantly less than what we've seen out of those guys. Shuttle, a 4.26, 3-cone, a 6.9, and then obviously a 38.5 vertical and a 10-foot, 7-inch broad. Those are solid, but I think out of those more so speed and quickness based drills, you do see a step back, right? And I do think that's pretty evident on film, as we'll hop right into this now. You see the 10.5, right? That is the lowest grade I've given anybody to this point. Not saying that he's necessarily bad. I just think that he's probably more so fit to be a slot receiver in that regard than somebody facing the elite, best of the best athletes on the outside, if that makes sense. And I know that might sound a little bit weird to people. They'll hear St. Brown and say, well, if he's a little bit slower and less quick, how is he going to be a slot receiver, right? Because a lot of times people associate just the slot with speed. And, in some cases that's accurate. You'll have a guy like Mecole Hardman, by example, play out of the slot. Well, other teams, they'll have guys like Julian Edelman in the slot, right? Who I don't think he's beating anybody in a race anytime soon. Or you'll have Golden Tate, who is significantly quicker than he is fast. But there's sort of 2 different types of slot receivers. And I think that St. Brown, if you're going to use him from the slot, certainly fits into that more so Edelman and Tate category than he does the Mecole Hardmans or, say Rondale Moore, who I just did in my previous video. I think that, they're probably going to play a similar role to an extent, but significantly different in their approach to that role, if that makes sense. In terms of just his ability to get open then, because I've said previously, If you aren't the quickest, fastest guy that's just going to be able to burn corners, you have to be able to, in some way or another, fool them into thinking you're running something that you're not, right? You have to pull out of the bag of tricks some ability to just create separation, right? And I think that St. Brown does do a very good job of that in his routes, whether it's with his release off the line of scrimmage or just at the top of his route stem in terms of, hey, he's running a curl route. Let me push that as hard and fast as I can vertically. And then at the very last second, let me cut back, right? Or if he's running a post route, by example, maybe take a quick step outside, make that cornerback begin to flip his hips because he thinks it's a corner route, and then bring it backside and bust it inside across the middle of the field for that deep post. Like I said, I think he does a good job at that, right? Maybe not quite as good as say a Devonta Smith or Rashad Bateman. And it's interesting because, if you watch him, you might argue that he is just as good, if not a better route runner than, say, Rashad Bateman or, say, Devonta Smith, right? And you might not be wrong, right? There might be just as much nuance. There might be just as much good footwork and, sort of playing that chess game, right? But the problem with St. Brown is at his sort of lesser athletic profile, it's not as effective. And I think that people need to realize that because, say, on that example of the post where he makes it look like a corner, the problem is that cornerback, knowing that he's facing a 4.5, 4.6 guy, he doesn't have to sell out on that corner quite like he did for Devonta Smith, right? Because now you're looking at a 4.3 guy. And, when that 4.3 guy makes a quick, sudden movement, you have to react to it. With a guy like St. Brown, even though he might be taking that very same step, I don't think he gets the same reactions from the defensive side of the ball that some of the other guys do. Hence, I gave him a 16.25. And I think that's a problem that he might see at the next level. Even though he's solid in this regard, if he wants to consistently continue to get open, he's going to have to work even harder to get even better, right? And it could be a challenge, right? Overcoming some of those more so athletic deficiencies. But based on the other parts of his game, I do think that he's up to it. He's just going to have to keep refining those skills and getting better, no question. One of those skills that needs to be refined then is his hands and consistency. I would say he's very similar to, say, a Terrace Marshall Jr. in that regard in terms of just way too many concentration drops. And it didn't seem like there were actually as many in 2019 as there were in 2020, but regardless, I don't care if you're playing inside or outside, you have to see the ball into your hands and catch the ball first, right? And I've said it with multiple guys now. I don't know if they're scared to get hit. I don't know if they're planning ahead and trying to make a 3-yard route into a 70-yard gain. Well, first you need to secure the 3-yard catch, right? And I think that he needs to do a significantly better job at that if he really does plan on being in the league for a long time. In terms of his contested catchability, I should note he is 5'11", right? If I haven't said that to this point, obviously I apologize, but you might be under the assumption that he's significantly smaller because I have been talking about him more so in that slot role. But it's not like he's Moore at 5'7", or even Jalen Waddle at 5'10", right? He's nearly 6 feet tall. And I think that there are occasions where you see that, right? You see him climbing the ladder and sort of plucking the ball out of the sky and winning directly over a cornerback, right? Those are very impressive reps. And I would say that you saw those more so in 2020 than you did in 2019, just based off where he's aligned, right? It'll be interesting to see how he's able to translate that at the next level because, he's not a guy, like I said, who's going to get a ton of separation just with his sheer athletic profile. So it'll be interesting to see if he becomes somebody more reliant on contested catches at the next level than he was in college, if that makes sense. Otherwise, in terms of tracking and body control, I gave him an 8.75, and this was honestly, in my opinion, probably his best attribute, right? This and route running were kind of neck and neck. I just felt like his ability to adjust to the ball midair and, like I said, haul in some of those crazy touchdowns in the back of the end zone, right? A lot of those plays that popped for me when I was watching Elijah Vera-Tucker came down to the tracking and body control, right? And I think that he really did excel in that regard and is one of the best guys that I've watched so far, right? And, whether that is going to manifest as a slot guy or as an outside guy, I think that he is certainly able to contort his body and make these crazy plays or adjust to the ball midair and give himself a better angle, just by example. I think he does a very good job there and should continue to do a good job in that regard at the next level. In terms of his rack ability then, again, not some crazy fast guy, not going to just be blazing by people, but I think he was decently shifty, right, in terms of after the catch making guys miss, was solidly agile, decently elusive in that regard. I also thought he, occasionally would be a pretty physical runner, right, which, at his sort of profile might be a little bit surprising, but a tough guy to tackle at times, which I certainly appreciated. Maybe not to the extent of, say, Jamar Chase, but certainly at that sort of next next tier or maybe a couple down. But either way, still pretty impressive considering. And then really lastly, in terms of his release, I actually did think that moving from the slot to the outside and now potentially from the outside back in, I think that's going to do him some good. I think that, having to line up potentially against some smaller, more athletic guys on the inside benefited him outside, right? Because, occasionally you'd see him lined up against a cornerback who had 2 or 3 inches on him, right? But was just a bigger, stiffer guy. Whereas now St. Brown's able to use his quick footwork at the line of scrimmage that he maybe, refined from that slot position outside to beat guys and get a clean release outside or inside from there, right? And I think that certainly helped him in 2020. That's why I wouldn't necessarily rule out him potentially being an outside receiver at the next level. I would just say he's more likely to find success from the slot, if that makes sense. Otherwise, just really quick, blocking and physicality, again, really not his thing. I gave him a 2.25, size 2.75 because I would say that falls sort of right in line with the other grades we've had to this point, under the positional averages in terms of his height, as well as just slightly in terms of his weight. So nothing crazy good nor bad there. And then lastly, in terms of athleticism, that is the lowest grade I've given to a receiver yet. But when the only other guys I've done are incredibly freaky Jalen Waddles, Rondé Moores, guys like that, I don't think a 3.75 is bad by any means. I just think that it's not necessarily his biggest strength as it is some of those other guys, right? So overall, you're going to see comes out to a 72 out of 100. Put that into my big board where, you give him the 4% position premium for being a wide receiver. And ultimately, I have him sort of towards the top of round 3, and ultimately we'll just say in the middle of day 2. I would say the major discussion then, comparing him to the other receivers, at least sort of in this range, is, where would you have him ranked between Moore, Marshall, and obviously St. Brown, right? I think that Terrace is just more so of a raw physical specimen, whereas St. Brown, he's a little bit more refined, most certainly in terms of his footwork, right? Whether it's off the line of scrimmage, in terms of his release at the top of his route stem, in terms of just fooling you on what he's running. But I do think that there's a slightly lower ceiling with a guy like St. Brown than there is with Marshall. Even though I don't think either of them are necessarily number 1 receivers at the next level, I think that Marshall's skill set could become one more so than St. Brown would, right? And that's why I do think he's slightly ahead of Amon. Otherwise, Moore, like I said, he's sort of a weird unicorn in the sense of has had so many injuries, and I'm not a doctor, so I can't really assess how far those would bring him down, right? So would you take him over Marshall? Would you take him over St. Brown? I think that's a discussion that certainly 32 teams should be having, but those 32 teams haven't made their medicals available to me. So I unfortunately can't really have that discussion. I think that they're, like I said, probably going to play similar roles just in terms of where they line up on the field, but used in drastically different ways, right? I think that St. Brown, you can use him more so downfield as a vertical threat from that slot position, whereas Moore, you're more so just going to try and get him the ball as fast as you can and let him make plays after the catch, right? I think that St. Brown, he's going to be better equipped to make plays downfield, right? And like I said, fool guys with that route running ability. Hopefully, on the inside as a slot guy, his size will be, giving him favorable matchups potentially to nickel cornerbacks, the occasional safety and or linebacker, right? I think that on the outside where he might be getting a little bit dwarfed, I think that on the inside, he could actually be pretty well equipped. Whereas a guy like Moore, obviously being 5'7", you're just trying to get him the ball in any way possible, right? I think that St. Brown could be a potential mismatch at the next level on the inside. That's why I like him there. And ultimately, that's why I do think I would take him right there in the middle of day 2. So with that being said, if you guys did enjoy this video today, make sure you not only leave a thumbs up, also leave a comment in the comment section down below. Do you agree with my grade for St. Brown? Do you disagree? Would you have him ranked higher? Do you have him ranked lower, right? And then really, of the 6 receivers that I've done so far, where do you have him ranked, right? Obviously, he's 6 of 6 for me to this point. But like I said, there's a slight caveat with Moore as well as some other guys left to come. So he most certainly won't be my lowest guy, I assume. But to this point, I would say that he's probably towards the bottom end of the 6. So with that being said, otherwise, if you did enjoy this video and want to see more like it, make sure you click that subscribe button so you're always in the loop with my future uploads. And otherwise, if you've missed out on previous uploads, make sure you click the playlist that should have just popped up on your screen. I know we're 70 plus uploads in so far in terms of prospect scouting reports. So hopefully if you guys have missed out on any or have some players that you maybe would have liked to have seen, hopefully I've already done them and you can click their video in that playlist. So with that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. I'm mic'd up. Now I'm mic'ing out. Peace, guys.